Hello, everyone. So excited to join you all here. Hopefully, the audio settles. And what I'll do is I'll just quickly introduce us all and walk through kind of our plan for the hour that we all have together. And really, our goal, because we know a lot of you have already read the kind of overview blog post, is to make sure that you have a lot of time to ask questions. Please feel free to start posting questions in the Q&A channel, and we can we'll be picking through them and bringing them up front onto the screen for everyone to see as and when it makes sense. But we'll also have like a dedicated half an hour at the end just for Q&A. And with that, let me dive in. So I'm Sandhya. I'm a GP at Unusual Ventures. And I'm joined here by my colleague, Wei, who's also at Unusual. Wei, say hello.
Hey, everyone. I'm Wei. Nice to meet you all.
And of course, we have our guests. We have Ben Williams, who's the current head of product growth at Snyk, which is an incredibly amazing role to have. I'm sure there's a lot of folks in the growth community who would love getting these juicy roles. So I can't wait to ask Ben how he's approaching it. And also, last but not the least at all, is the founder of Snyk, Guy Podjarny. But Guy, Ben, please say hello.
Hey, everyone. Hey, folks. Happy to share some knowledge here or some past mistakes.
So amazingly humble. First of all, thank you so much for joining. I know it's kind of, at the end of your day, it's the beginning of ours. So just kind of the beauty of remote work as we are across so many different time zones. So I want to kind of dive in by talking about like the broad topics we want to cover that, at least we think makes Snyk so fascinating. The first is just, the way you guys approached security with the DevOps playbook, which I think is so fascinating. So Guy, would love to hear more about like what gave you the conviction to do that. And Ben, since you actually come from the DevOps world, like what you see really translated and of course, want to talk about kind of the early days of Snyk, your journey towards finding product market fit. What was the role that the virality within the open source community played, and the fact that you were so intentional about it? Would love to talk more about that. And then I think a third topic that we don't really go into a lot in the blog post, which I think you have such a wealth of information to offer on, is the way Snyk thought about use cases rather than features when it came to product strategy, packaging, and pricing, which I think everyone strives to do but struggles to really execute on. And then last but not the least, just, how the growth organization has evolved from kind of being, all of Snyk working on growth to being more and more specialized over time. I think those are one of the four, broad topics we want to cover. And Wei, do you want to kick us off with the first one?
Yeah, thanks, Sandhya. Guy and Ben, it's awesome to have you on today. I want to start off by getting your thoughts on some of the macro trends we're seeing in security today. In many respects, there are more cybersecurity challenges now than ever before, and it's become a topic of board level discussion for many organizations. But there's really two trends within that really stand out that I want to kind of dive into. Is the first is that organizations are shifting left. They're meaning they're enabling developers to build in security controls earlier. And the second is that there's just been an explosion in the usage of open source software to build applications, to stand up infrastructure, and that's led to new security issues and need to protect what we now think of as the software supply chain. So to start off, Guy, I'd love to pose a question to you. What were some of the early indicators to you as you were starting and building Snyk that shift left and open source adoption were going to become major drivers in terms of how people had to think about security?
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for the question, Wei. all of these things are a little bit of the culmination of what you get exposed to, right? So, for me specifically, I was part of the sort of AppSec, early AppSec days, built the first web app firewall, or so was a part of that team, App Shield and App Security Scanner, AppScan. And we, this was a startup that got acquired by a startup that got acquired by IBM. And the group in IBM that acquired us was Rational, was the developer tool part of IBM. And from the early days really of application security, it was clear that finding the issues late is a problem, but it was much more of an efficiency play. It was much more around, we had all these charts showing how it's like 100 times cheaper to fix an issue when you code it versus, catching it in production, which is still true. But we couldn't really, we failed at actually getting developers to adopt it. We got acquired into Rational. We succeeded financially with the products, but we couldn't really get it into the code. And I left IBM and I founded a web performance startup and was a part of the sort of the DevOps motion. That startup got acquired by Akamai, and I was CTO there for a bunch of years, and really experienced the sort of the first wave, if you will, of DevOps, and have sort of seen two things. One, that with the advent of DevOps, the importance of independent teams that own products and own their deliverables from end to end has and will continue to explode. It's just sort of driving and increasingly there was data that shows that it's just fundamentally driving better business success, better business outcomes. It's just not just nice to have, and is becoming something that is necessary to be competitive in the market. And so that will continue, and that with that, security is just not keeping up. It's just like fundamentally the whole notion was never amazing of a centralized security organization is just falling apart. And so the need is sort of going from a nice to have, from an efficiency play to a must have to. It's the only way to really build secure software in the modern world, is to embed it into software development. And the second was that we now have a model to learn from. So you want to reinvent some of the wheels. We don't want to reinvent all of them. And what was kind of made visible, I guess, to me through the performance days was that there is a playbook, there is a model. Kind of have seen how do companies like Fastly, for instance, and Cloudflare competed against Akamai with the DevOps playbook, coming along and building something that is attuned to their to the team's use case, to the independent team's use cases and needs, and sort of new perspective on how they operate if they want to own, in that case, delivery. And so those two sort of inspired that. On one hand, there is a need that is growing, and on the other hand, there is a model now to mimic, and inspired kind of the creation of Snyk with this sort of dev first ethos, or kind of a lens that said, let's build a developer tooling company modeled after these dev tools, these sort of DevOps companies, but that tackles the problem of security, of securing the software as you build it as part of your end-to-end ownership. And yeah, I mean, the implementation was harder than the concept, and we weren't entirely unique in doing it. We were one of a handful that have sort of tried that path, but it worked out well, and sort of grown. And I think today, at the time, you had to convince people, you had to explain why. People would sort of feel like they're ahead. It's like, we're not ready for it yet. Statements of that nature. Today, I think it's a more well understood of, yes, I have to do this. Now the question is how, and is Snyk the right solution for me, etc.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting how you had that foundational insight that security had to align, and really incorporate DevOps principles and so on, and really be handled and implemented in similar fashion. And Ben, you spent a lot of time around DevOps teams. I'm curious to get your thoughts on what parallels do you see to DevOps trends playing out in security today, and how does that impact go to market for a company and product like Snyk?
Yeah, I think we learned a long time ago that DevOps and continuous delivery, it's kind of some secret sauce that allows us to innovate faster. with long release cycles, every release has high levels of cost and risk. Each release is difficult and potentially painful. But we learned that with tighter collaboration between dev and ops teams, and a shift towards continuous delivery, then that risk, that cost, that pain of every release became smaller. And the rapid learning cycles it enables started to allow a much faster rate of innovation. Then when you think about security, you consider the historic role of security teams in the SDLC. They've very much acted as a gate for developers, often with a lot of manual process overhead, long associated wait times. And I think it was just inevitable as people saw what was happening with DevOps that those involved with any aspect of security in the SDLC started to kind of question this and think about how they could flip the script there. Jez Humble described that iron triangle, right? That traditional project management trade-off between scope, cost, and time that needs to happen to maintain a desired level of quality, and how DevOps and continuous delivery ultimately invalidates that traditional model. And I think the same thing can be said around security in place of quality, or even as a form of quality. So if you think when security can become a first-class citizen in the development process, and by that I mean something that developers don't just concern themselves with security, but they actually own the security of their applications and are at the same time supported with low friction processes and tools, then the result is more software delivered in shorter time frames with lower cost, yet with an improved security posture.
No, that makes a lot of sense, Ben. And of course, there's so many different facets and areas of security. And with this sort of foundational insight around aligning with DevOps and catering and serving developers, Guy, you've previously mentioned about how developers want depth, right? Which is why you, for instance, chose to focus on Node.js in the beginning. But if you kind of go back to late 2015, you launched Snyk, you put the product out there. Curious, how did you decide on the scope? Why did you decide on kind of just a CLI to start? Focus on command line tool. How did you and the team think about what was enough for an MVP? You had this notion of let's align and do it sort of in a DevOps friendly way. You had a general idea of the use case. How did you think about the scope of the product to start with?
And I think this is a really great question, because if I kind of try to make this a little more vivid and visceral for everybody here, when you guys did your beta launch in a very well attended conference, your company was 3 months old, right? And I think generally, at least in my observation today, founders are very hesitant to launch a product that early. Even in a private beta, they're very hesitant to go start launching that early, and people take more like a year to kind of start kind of showing their baby, right? So I'm really curious, was that just you were hungry for feedback, or was there any doubt in your mind? Were you worried it's too early? So I'd love to kind of go back to that time and understand the debate.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts for, first of all, to clarify, it was a crappy little product that we launched. It was nothing glamorous or sort of amazing. It could patch vulnerabilities, but there were no patches in the database, and it was beta. We didn't ask anybody sort of to pay for it. It was just try it out. And first and foremost, it was so we could start iterating. I mean, you can't learn if you don't get feedback. And so if you're in that, if you're in your cave, right? If you sort of got in your cave and you work on something wondrous and you try to kind of come out with it a year later, that's a year of lost feedback, sort of lost opportunity to get feedback. And I think really the first feedback we needed to get was, do people care? When we sort of talk about this problem, do not just people as in security people, but developers. Do developers care? Does it resonate? Do people say, yeah, that's something I should be doing. It's something I should care about. And so I think that to me is just the fundamental. If you want to build a growth business, if you want to build to optimize for this sort of self-serve adoption, you want people to actually discover the product, care about it. If you want to break through to developers, then really your biggest risk is the developers don't pick it up. They don't really care about it. So yes, you cared about the experience, the success, but really the first and foremost was just to sort of see, do they even respond? Does that even resonate? And so to do that and to launch early, there is an element of sort of first impression. So it was really around building the narrowest product that we could find, so we can ship it and we could provide a very distinct kind of unit of value. And the CLI was just like a clear-cut version of that. I will say that the idea of the Git integration was nowhere like we didn't even think about it at the time. That came from the feedback, from the iterations, from the learnings, in which we sort of saw users downloading the CLI, trying it, liking it, tweeting about it, not putting it into the build. It's okay. So you learn why wouldn't you talk to people? You sort of look from the data, you theorize, and you understand. Well, it's still too hard. Friction is still too hard, too high, and that led us to sort of ideating and getting to this idea of, okay, what if we made it a next kind of experience with GitHub and kind of integrated, and a lot has evolved since. And so really you have to put yourself out there. I'd go as far as saying that there's almost like a level of hubris in sort of going off and sort of building it yourself and coming out. I know a lot of people, they don't launch, but they do work with design partners, so maybe they kind of dampen that a bit. But you don't necessarily know better, like the fact that you have some theory, some grand theory. I was, I think, reasonably qualified to start Snyk, but pretending that I have all the answers is wrong. And had I built a full-fledged, full database, full functionality for that CLI, and took it 6 more months before I built it, the Git integration that was eventually needed for us to sort of drive a certain viral loop, our first one, that would have been delayed by 6 months. So yeah, just optimizing for learning and getting out there. And yeah, it's embarrassing, but it's a V1. It's always going to be crap. Like it's not, it's never going to be good. So you better start your journey towards that V2 that would be a little bit better and the eventual actual great version that you have.
So maybe a great segue to our second topic around early growth loops, right? So I remember watching the Snyk Stranger launch video you had, right? Your company's 3 months old. You have this like very minimal CLI-based MVP, but you were already thinking about, okay, how are people going to discover this? Because I remember in your presentation, you talked about, hey, if you'll get a badge if your open source project doesn't have any vulnerabilities. So even when the company was 3 months old, you had this intuition for, hey, how do we get organic awareness? How do we make our users kind of show Snyk? And so would love to understand, just like 6 months into the company, what were the what we fancy people call growth loops, right? What were the things you already had in place? And where did the intuition for those come from? Like, why did you prioritize those? And I think the big motivation for me asking this is we often meet founders who think that's like a, post-product market fit issue to think about, right? Like first we'll get product market fit, then we will think about growth and awareness. So would love to understand, do you agree with that? Do you think very differently about, the role that those tactics play so early in your company journey?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think my answers are filled with naivety, but we definitely didn't know the term growth loops. We were not sort of an expert, but what we were setting up to do is we were setting out to instill a behavior within the development communities. So our drivers around badges that were like right there at the very beginning, even before the sort of the open source usage. Well, the fact that it was free for open source to begin with, and the badge to advocate it, they were really around spreading the gospel. It was around telling people, yes, there is a way in which you can have a solution that is developer friendly and that builds security, right? That there is that it is your responsibility, and generally perceive open source projects as kind of role models. They develop in the open, they're very public. And so we wanted to drive adoption within open source. We wanted to advertise that. And yes, we did think about that, sort of creating a freemium user base that in turn we expected, didn't totally pan out at the beginning, to kind of convert into the first sort of wave of payments. And so I think while we didn't have, I guess what I would sort of say in terms of repeatable learnings is, yes, today you can be smarter, you can understand that there is a growth loop, you can try to kind of be for it, and there's a whole bunch of things we could have done better. But fundamentally, if you're trying to drive change, then you need to talk to people, and I think people make the mistake that they think that these conversations are for marketing purposes. For some, indeed, when I figure out the product, then I will start marketing it. And I think underappreciate the fact that that is the way that you learn. You engage with the community, you try to do it. And if people don't want to hear what you have to say, that's a learning. And if you are unsuccessful in getting through it through certain venues, that should teach you something. That should tell you that maybe they don't perceive the solution or capability that you have in the right vein, that maybe you don't have the right people in the team that they listen to, or all of these things are learnings. And so really for us, it was kind of a part of the crusade, right? A part of the mission to advocate for developer security as a whole. Even if the sort of the means worked out pretty well, badges were never tremendous in their impact, but at the beginning they were indeed our probably first viral loop. Subsequently, by the time we launched the GitHub integration and the open source, we did think about the fact that when you open a fixed pull request, people that watch that project get an email, they get notified, and that acts as a virality, which was more effective than the badges. But I think the mission was really around spreading the word.
Makes sense. And I love, the how you put it that it's talking to people is not marketing. It's about learning whether they care about what you have to say, and are you on the same page about the problem and the solution, and not to think about it as marketing.
Exactly. Even if they're not ones that are going to pay you, right? And especially if you're not, there's really no skin. This is purely, is this useful to you? And that's a great form of learning.
And Ben, I'm curious now that you have kind of instrumented the Snyk growth machine. How do you think about the contribution of that free for open source strategy from the early days? Do you guys now understand how much awareness you can attribute to some of those early strategies?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really, we've got an extremely strong core product in how it supports our enterprise sales motion. So a significantly large percentage of our revenue comes from users who had significant activity within the product before any kind of opportunity was created. So that decision from day one, from Guy and Co to kind of make this free first and think about monetization later, it's absolutely paid off. And it was a similar thing when we kind of created the growth team on a much more micro level later. We didn't focus on self-serve monetization at first. We focused on earlier parts of the funnel, on acquisition and on activation. But to the question on data, there was some good prior art, I would say, when I arrived. Big shout out to some of our marketing leaders, Lee and Francesca. There was a strong and growing growth marketing team in place that they covered a lot of the areas of kind of acquisition vehicles off products and lifecycle nurtures. And we did have a lot of data that existed in tools like Google Analytics, but the challenge there was that data was primarily focused on the marketing side. And on the product side, we actually had mountains of data, more than you could make sense of in many ways. And there were two real, I think, key issues with that. First, it was it was almost exclusively systemic data. In other words, like the results of what our users and customers were doing. Things like the number of projects imported, or the number of tests executed, or the number of vulnerabilities detected, or number of pull requests raised. And it was all very useful data in some specific context, in many specific contexts, in fact. But it didn't tell us how our users were really interacting with the platform. We were really, I think, lacking behavioral data. And the second thing is that, from early on, the R&D teams had taken the approach of, let's collect everything and try and make sense of the data later. And that created significant challenges, as it turned out, in insight generation. So it was one of the first things I did when joining. It was kind of work with the teams to build a data strategy and evaluate and build out a supporting tech stack. And internally, we refer to that as our V2 analytics and experimentation stack. We had Segment in place already as a CDP, but something I felt very strongly about, felt it was very important for us to do, was to be much, much more intentional about the data that we collect. And that's taking a very, very different approach from the earlier instrument everything path. So the pieces that were missing, I think, were, first of all, a strong behavioral analytics platform. And as well as that, something that would let us be intentional about the data we collect and be collaborative in our schema design. Because when you're collecting data, it's multi-use, right? We needed to acknowledge that it's multi-use and involve people in the instrumentation design that supported that. An example might be instrumenting events for the purposes of understanding user onboarding flow. But those same events also have utility in driving lifecycle email events, for example, or feeding into our PQL engine, and involving the stakeholders in those in the data design is really beneficial in the bigger picture. And there's a couple of tools that I'm kind of aware of in that space, but the one we went with was a tool called Iteratively, and that not only allows us to collaborate on the shape of the data, but also to apply templates for consistency, and it subsequently integrates into our CI/CD pipelines such that instrumentation of the application can be validated against the schema we've designed, which means we really have absolute confidence in the data that we see. And that is just so important. For the analytics platform itself, we went with Amplitude, which turned out to be a fortuitous decision, since beyond it being a great tool and a huge enabler in helping self-serve answers within our team to growth and product questions, midway through our purchase of Iteratively, Amplitude actually acquired them. So I'm glad it wasn't another company that bought them up. All that being said, tools, they're ultimately an enabler. The more difficult part, in my experience at Snyk and prior, has been building and reinforcing a culture of impact and learnings, establishing practices of experimentation and codification and socialization of learnings to leverage those learnings, and associated ceremonies to reinforce the culture, and so on. Tooling, great. You can talk for tooling for days. At the end of the day, there's a ton of great tools out there. I think probably one of the important things is to ensure that the teams who are using these, primarily the R&D teams, they're really bought into which way you go. So in our case, the R&D teams led the evaluation of multiple vendors. It was kind of new ways of working for many of them, and they needed to learn a lot about the whole process of growth as they were investing in kind of evaluating these tools. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they then felt much more involved, invested in the decision, and I think that made subsequent adoption and rollout, and therefore bringing benefits of leveraging the data to Snyk. It made that bit much more easy.
Yeah. I want to say that Ben and Francesca kind of joining before, and then the two of them working together and the broader team kind of turned it from an art to a science. So before, if you sort of imagine the experience pre-Francesca, pre-Ben, It was much more of a, hey, how would we sort of drive growth? Maybe we can do this and this. We'd get a bunch of people in the room says, oh yeah, that sounds cool. Yeah, we're says, oh no, someone put new holes, and then we'd kind of drive it, and we'd kind of see the end of like, well, we launched this thing. Did we see a bump in user registrations? Did we see a bump in we're kind of blind to the middle, and somewhat big strokes in what we've done, and so like and Francesca, kind of the team right now, have kind of turned it into more of a science. There's still an artsy element. You still have to hypothesize. You still have to be creative, right. But it's much more of a system now. And when it's a system, when it works, you can invest in it, you can grow it, you can expand it. But of course, that also comes with cultural changes and tools and all that required system.
I love that. I can never remember where I heard this phrase, but I repeat it quite a lot, and it's that growth is the art and science of the application of the scientific method to improving business KPIs. I just love that quote.
Yeah, I think the thing that I really appreciate, and you guys intuitively got right, was that a growth strategy at first is about the big swings. You're not trying to like optimize something you don't have. You're trying to like come up with a foundation which requires very big ideas that you should not need to A/B test. Like that should be very obvious if anyone liked it or not. You don't need a fine instrument because it's supposed to be a very big swing, like making it free, adding a paywall, like really big swings. But once you have that foundation, you can actually instrument the machine, optimize it, scale it. And I think the mistake that a lot of folks make is try to like create a machine without having the art first, without having the big swings, the big ideas. So if you bring in someone like Ben and there's no foundation, you can't expect your newly hired head of growth to suddenly be effective, right? Because you haven't built that foundation of art for them to come, improve on. And I think that's a really big learning very important learning for a lot of early stage teams and founders. I want to talk more about. Sorry, go ahead, Guy.
Yeah, it's just a small comment, which is absolutely agree. You can't optimize without data. You need the big swings to kind of get the initial data to get the paths. There's still probably a bunch of things we could have done a bit more systemically at the beginning, but that's always the case. But the notion of the big swings is also important later. So we had, it's always ebbs and flows, and we've had ebbs in which we got too systemized and got too small, kind of in a bunch of these ideas, and then come back as well. But what are the big swings? And we come back, we do those. But now when we do the big swings, which we're much more thoughtful about them, we're able to assess them sooner to sort of see them. But I agree with you. Like it can be the first motion.
I want to come back to kind of growth org structure, metrics, KPIs, etc. But kind of talking about big swings, one of the first big swings that didn't work for Snyk was this idea of self-serve revenue, right? Like way back in 2016, you said, okay, we have thousands of free users. Let's see if they'll pay for this. So I want to kind of go back to that moment and the product strategy and the packaging strategy. Could you walk us through kind of what did the product look like? Like, do you already have multiple products? Did you just have the one product? And and how did you think about kind of the pricing strategy then versus now? I think in 2021 you're relaunching the self-serve revenue. So again, like you're making the kind of similar big swing again. So I'd love kind of closing the loop on why try that again. And what has changed. But first, like going back to 2016, like how did you think about packaging, pricing at the time?
Yeah, and pardon the sirens in the background. I'm on the 16th floor, but they seem still seem to sort of get all the way up there. So the product at the time was basically Snyk open source, what today is Snyk open source. So finding out which dependencies you're using, whether they're vulnerable, and helping you fix that in a dev first continuous fashion. And it was just for Node.js at the time when we launched it. And indeed, we kind kind of opened it up. We made it commercial. It came with the Git integration, so we kind of took off the beta tag and we introduced some sort of tiers of payment. We had a lot of deliberation around what the tiers of payments are and the scopes and and then we gave it a couple of months, just kind of doing it. We sort of, we didn't want to rush our free users, and so we gave some grandfathered period of time that was free, and then after that it would be there, and hardly anybody bought. There was really abysmal success in terms of who purchased, and I think it's hard to sort of fully kind of reverse engineer the moment on it, right? At the moment, I think what it told us is it kind of was a bit of a shattered a dream a little bit, right? I talk about things that you get right or wrong. I have in my sort of early seed deck, I have a sales-led scratch, sort of self-serve. So a no sales team, or even I have maybe it's a sales team, and there's a scratch through it. It was very much this sort of dream of look what we're getting. We're getting all these thousands of users. Of course, now developers have embraced security. They're going to purchase. And lo and behold, they didn't. And in the moment, it was, there's a moment of whatever, crying yourself to sleep, and not quite that bad, but there's a moment of just dealing with it. Okay, something didn't work. We have to figure it out. And then there was the kind of that sort of subsequently just a million conversations. Is you talk to those people, so we went to the platform, we did have basic data, we've seen successful users that we've identified come from sort of relevant companies, and we kind of reached out to them. So it's why didn't you buy? Why aren't you purchasing? We did still use kind of network and conversations that we've sort of had with security teams. So would this be relevant? And really, I don't know, I'm trying to sort of think about whether to sort of share what we've learned in the moment versus what we've learned in hindsight, which I think is a bit deeper. I mean, in the moment, what we've learned was, one, we need to broaden, and we need more language support. And well, you know what? I'll go back. Like I say, the first thing we learned was developers are ready to use it, but they're not ready to buy it. And if I think of it today in terms of friction, the friction involved in a developer starting to use a free tool and connecting and all that is far lower than them deciding to actually purchase that. And when it's something that's atypical for them to do. So they weren't ready for it. The market wasn't ready for it. And then the buyers, we didn't actually have what they needed. We didn't have the breadth of language support the security people needed, because they need something that covers more of their application to be able to kind of attest to its security. We didn't support GitHub Enterprise on-prem, which at the time was all on-prem, which frankly is an indicator of a security conscious organization. So basically we didn't support the most security conscious, the ones most amenable to purchasing. And we lacked features and capabilities that were needed for the security team to be successful at operating a dev-centric program, notably reports, governance, those capabilities. And so the subsequent years were a bit of a struggle, because the real hard part was sticking to the dev first ethos, not perceiving it, and we got a lot of feedback that sort of advised otherwise, but not perceiving it as look, it's just proven again that developers don't care about security. Fine, it was a nice little cool tool, so they picked it up, but they don't actually care about security. So not surrendering to kind of that impulse or that sort of narrative, and instead just persevering and figuring out, continuing to invest. Throughout that time, the vast majority of investment was still within dev, but trying to kind of break through to the buyer in the process. We're fortunate to have had, very supportive investors in BoldStart and sort of our other investors at the time, but really BoldStart led the charge at ensuring that we're sort of still funded through the journey and doing so in a fun and friendly fashion, and doing a seed extension with us. And so, we persevered, and we got to the point where it was broad enough, and we broke through. And at that point, we started benefiting from that sort of wave. So anyways, that was the story back then, and we kind of pivoted out of it. I'll let Ben kind of tell the story of the renewed path here. But at the time, we got to a place in which we said, look, freemium is for developers, individual developers. They pick it up, they use the product, they run with it. It's for open source. Purchasing, that's for security. So let's not get in the way of developer adoption of security. That's the most important thing, and focus our purchasing on security and those governance capabilities.
Guy, it's interesting from a product standpoint. You talk a lot about learning quickly, getting feedback, adding these features that you're referencing. Curious in terms of, we talked to a lot of founders who early on focus around sort of a beachhead use case, for getting to product market fit. And then once they've hit that, the question comes up around, when and how to expand to other use cases, other adjacencies. So in Snyk's case, you had the core product around Snyk open source, and then over time you added support for containers, and then you add support for infrastructure as code. And I'm curious, like, what were some of the key considerations that you and the team had in terms of determining when and how to expand? I mean, clearly within the open source product, like you said, you need to add support for more languages, and you need some of those, enterprise grade features. But curious, like, how did you think about going outside of Snyk open source and adding additional products, for different areas, for different use cases?
Yeah, I mean, I think wish I had kind of a perfect sort of a silver bullet for sort of for precisely how to get it right, but you have to. So I believe in like this notion of big vision, small steps, and so you have to understand where you're aiming. If you don't know where that is, and if that's not big enough, then it's kind of pointless. And so you do need to be aiming at something that is more than the beachhead. Getting the beachhead and then figuring out what happened is a very high risk move. And so for us, the destination has always been helping develop like developer security. This notion of get security to embrace, get developers to embrace security, sort of embedded in security to the fabric of software development. And that's always been the case. In fact, I remember sort of struggling a little bit to not know how to lead when it's sort of introducing Snyk to a customer at the time. Is that, do I lead with open source security or do I lead with developer security? When you have like a blurb, right? When you have like 2 lines to show. And it's always been like developer security was really the core. And so the decision to expand products and expand container to container and such, that was really built on that. It was built on the notion of we are going to be a multi-product company. And we need to demonstrate, like open source was the beachhead. Even in the very, very beginning in the seed deck, there were already multiple products there. We got the timing incorrect. We thought it'll take 3 months. It took 2 years. But we did know that we're going to launch additional products. And so it was important. It was still a conversation. There was pushback. The board, to their credit, they challenged me. There were sort of people there that didn't think it was right, but they trusted that we know what we're doing. And we expanded and we tried it out. And what we've done is we've contained the risk. And so I think that path worked out well, and we've launched it. There's a whole bunch of learnings about the launch of the second product. But I think you have to aim the vision, and you have to make sure that you have later on multiple lanes that you are going down, and they have to have different time horizons. Now, when you do that, when you create something that is a longer time horizon, that needs to be the minority investment. So what you shouldn't do is like pivot the company to now work on this new thing, but rather you need to think about how do you gradually do it. And so we shipped the product as an add-on. We put a handful of people on it, minimal disruption to it. We allowed some duplication and some inefficiency in the new product so that the vast majority of focus, vast majority of attention kind of goes into the new ones. And decisions about new languages before that in the features, decisions later on, they've always kind of modeled after that. And even today, when we launch a new product like Snyk Learn, which Ben and team run, it's a team, it runs it, it takes attention. It's the notion of like, being totally, disruption free is a fallacy, but you have to, like, you can't, otherwise you just kind of wither, right? You don't, so you have to have always some sticks in the fire, some things that aim towards that bigger vision, that is the scout force to the next horizon, the next step, towards that big vision. So I hope that answers the question there.
Yeah, we actually have a couple of really good audience questions I'll share. So this one is from Megha. And I know you'll say, you have never transitioned away from being dev focused, very important, you're dev and enterprise. But I think this is a really good question, which is, okay, if you have, business users and developers who need very different go-to-market motions, how do you go about it at an early stage? I think this is something that so many people are curious about. I would love how you guys thought about it, Guy. Maybe in like 2016, 17, just after the self-serve revenue had stopped playing out, what did you change in terms of your plan to say, okay, we need to like figure out the CISO buyer, what do we do differently?
Yeah, I think I would absolutely say that we didn't pivot out of developers. We're developers are still the core, and I think that's really the question. Which is for us, and I guess the question is, for Mega, whether that's also the case for you. The developers are the core within the business as well. So the belief has always been that security succeeds because of the developer adoption. And so what we needed is we needed to add capabilities, and then we needed to connect with security people and expand those. So there's an element of zero-sum game because you do need to take some people off building features that are developer-oriented to features that are security-oriented. But what you can't do is you can't stop making developers successful if that is the thing that you will differentiate on, if that is the thing that would make you successful. And so I think that's probably the reason. For us, it was that we actually isolated. The majority of the company stayed developer, and we created what we called an enterprise team that was really sort of the security team. And that team was the one that sort of focused on building those capabilities because it needed dedicated attention, right? You need anything. When you prioritize, there's really only two models to be doing these different swim lanes. It's like you either put them all in one backlog and you prioritize within them, or you do resource escalation. You dedicate people and they have the leadership. And I think there are different times to different things. When you talk about different users, different stakeholders, that's a classic one to have resource isolation to identify how much of the company do you want to dedicate to it. And then the other thing you have to understand, and we had to kind of learn, is how do you get to those buyers? Is it through the developers or is it direct outreach? And we've learned that we need both. That the journey from the developer to the security person is longer than the journey from the developer to the, say, development manager. And so we need more effort to get to the buyer from the user than maybe other dev tools. And so we got better at that journey, but also in parallel, we kind of reached out directly we do the pincer movement, we're going directly to the buyer. And when we do that, we do try, and this only came later on with sort of Ben and team doing the product qualified accounts and better instrumentation of understanding whether an account is already using it. But even beforehand, just touting the fact that certain free users are using the product already, or even just the presence in the ecosystem to demonstrate how we will be more dev friendly than your alternatives. So I guess I would say, Mega, you have to think about whether for you developers was just the beachhead, was it just features, and you've sort of satisfied enough of that use case and you can move on to something else, or is it meant to be a differentiator and a driver, in which case you have to keep that at the core and continue advancing it.
I'll just add. I'm just going to add. Sorry, Sandhya.
Sorry, go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, just a little bit to Guy's answer. And this is some wisdom that Guy had kind of shared with a few of us in product leadership a few months ago, and it was quite eye-opening, really. And it was that focus on the developer, and how being dev friendly really isn't enough, because everyone can create features, capabilities, satisfy use cases that serve developers and do them in a way that developers enjoy using them. But developers exist in an ecosystem, in a team, in a company, working with other stakeholders, working with other personas, and work gets from developers' keyboards into production and into the hands of users through a network of stakeholders. And so thinking about how we need to support those other stakeholders in the ecosystem, but through the lens of the developer, was a really critical, I think, philosophical advantage for Snyk in how we approach software development. So even if we're serving the needs of the AppSec persona, we're building features for them in a way that ultimately helps them in progressive thinking and acting organizations better serve the needs of their developer communities.
Makes sense. And I'm sharing this second question because I think you're basically answering it, which is that, yes, like, first of all, I'm sure documentation, super important to get developers to actually use your product. But I think the broader point here is that even the enterprise buyer cares about developers' success, right? It's not like the CISO is buying Snyk saying, I don't care if the developers never adopted. Developer adoption matters to them a lot. So the fact that your tool's dev focused is a big competitive advantage. So it's a part of the overall story, even for the buyer. It's not just just awareness strategy. It's kind of full life cycle. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely full life cycle. Yeah.
And maybe this is a good transition to kind of the, how you think about the growth org today, because you have, of course, the free plan where you're acquiring new developers, but you also need developer adoption post enterprise sale. And now you're introducing this, self-serve revenue plan again. So would love, to understand how you're organizing these priorities around the developer journey, and what are you learning from relaunching the self-serve plan?
Sure. So I think before we launched the new plans in April last year, I think it was, we had 3 paid plans: Standard, Pro, Enterprise. It's really important for the plans to have an underlying philosophy and narrative that makes sense to the market, and that was something we really wanted to emphasize more deeply in designing and launching the new plans. So for us, that philosophy is broadly based on scale and the associated use cases that become more and more important as an organization scales. So our lowest tier paid plan now is called Team. Somewhat self-descriptively caters for the use cases of small numbers of teams. Our business plan focuses on use cases that are typically more prevalent as multiple teams are working in the context of a group or a business unit. At that point, you start to get governance capabilities, including reporting, starting to become important there. And finally, our enterprise plan satisfies requirements that are typically arising at larger scale, like support for self-managed container registries or custom SSO. And I think it also speaks a little to that the macro trend of shift left that was talked about earlier, but actually about how that not being enough. And in the case of security, at least, the other important vector here is that the decentralization of responsibility for software security. So control of software security going from this centralized AppSec kind of unit down to developers, while still maintaining the need for that centralized visibility and governance at scale. And the way we've kind of designed our plans, I think, try to cater for all of that.
Yeah, and what I would say, and I'm kind of peeking ahead a little bit at some of the questions. I see there's a question about how we sort of monetized, how do we split it, and I think that very much sort of relates to this. And fundamentally, it's around what functionality, which use cases need to be supported at which plan, and then be amazing at satisfying that use case within that plan. Don't kind of hold back just so the people. And so I think what has happened is, I'll kind of skip a little bit the exact journey, but as we sort of examine the market, what we've seen was in our standard plan, we had a mixed use case. We had an element of people using it for teams, and for them, it's just like a team. There might have been even multiple sort of standard plan users within the same organizations, and for them it was an overkill. So it was too much. It was expensive. It didn't really make sense for them, and there was a bunch of functionality they didn't use. And then we had people using that same plan for governance of maybe a small enough business, and for them it was sort of very sufficient, maybe, like they needed all the functionality in it, but they lacked some capabilities that we might have had at sort of the professional tier. And so I think that was one of the drivers. Was we've seen that confusion, and that drove some of the change. And then the other was really an understanding that within the free tier that was supporting, as I kind of mentioned before, just sort of everything, like developers will be free. We did learn, indeed, in that standard, we started seeing, developers picking it up, development teams buying the standard plan, but really for a team within an organization. And so it drove us to just reconsider, reassess. And, now when I look at it, and even then it was use case oriented, now the use cases are accepting that the use case of continuous security, the use case of a development team saying, I need to produce secure software, and I'm on the hook for it. And it's not about security governance. It's about me producing quality software that needs to be secure, and therefore I will purchase a solution that helps me do that. Is something, frankly, just the market wasn't ready for it at the time. And we made the bet based on our data, based on assessment, based on conversations, that based on what we've seen with standard plan, that now the market is ready, and we used the opportunity to realign the other businesses. And so those two things kind of drove the tiering. But that's how we make decisions around it. And I think fundamentally it cannot be feature based. It has to be around which use cases do you satisfy in every one of those tiers. And then that also helps you simplify as you add new functionality. Which tier should it be added to? Well, it should be obvious, because it should be around it. And you need to resist the temptation of, no, but I want to tempt these users over to the higher tier. That's a very dangerous slippery slope. You're muted.
Sorry, it's just this is the 2022 t-shirt as well. You're on mute. Thank you so much for your time, Guy and Ben. I know it's like really late there, so we will end on time and not go over. But I know everybody here in the audience really found your story so thoughtful and really insightful, and we appreciate your willingness to give back and spend this time with the founder community, helping them on the many similar, slightly different flavors of the same startup journey that we are all on. So yeah, thank you so much. And if you are open to having folks reach out or ask more questions, what would be the best way to contact you to share with them, and then we can wrap this up.
Sure, I'll start with that. Probably the best way is on LinkedIn. I love geeking out about all this stuff, products and growth. So, anyone wants to chat and bend my ear and share experiences, I'd love to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd sort of say the same, which is LinkedIn is probably a better platform for me than Twitter. You can tweet at me, but the risk of that is you can probably DM me on Twitter. The only thing I would ask is patience. I get to these pings and I do respond to them, but it's a full backlog. So, it happens eventually, but not immediately.
Awesome.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Ray, for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you all again next month for another awesome fireside chat with a great company.
Thanks
everyone.
Ray.
Thanks, Sandhya.
Thanks, folks.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.